Welcome everyone to episode 11 of the Exoskeletons and Wearable Robotics podcast. I'm with Professor Tom Sugar of the Wearable Robotics Association, and I am Bobby Marino for the Exoskeleton Report. And we have a special guest today, Marisol Barrero. Before we begin, we have no new Patreons, but we want to take the time to thank our current ones. Our VIP tier, Volker Bartenbach, Rita Vasquez Torres, Minmar, and our corporate level sponsors, Humantech and Oxivo. Thank you for your support on Patreon. Hi, Marisol. Hi, Tom. How are you guys doing?
Good, Bobby. Excited to be here. Thanks for your invitation.
I'm excited to have you both here. So today we're honored to have Marisol Barrero as our EXR podcast guest. Marisol is the co-founder and current board member of the Automotive Exoskeleton Group, AEXG, which is sponsored or got its start from the Wearable Robotics Association. She is a member of the ASTM International Committee F48 on exoskeletons and exosuits. And Marisol is a frequent speaker at leading safety and technology conferences, including the Applied Ergonomics Conference, WearCon, and the Enterprise Wearable Technology Summit. Marisol's experience includes her work as an ergonomics consultant with Mitsui how do you say that, Marisol? Mitsui
Sumitomo.
Insurance Group. Thanks for the
A
help.
long time ago. I still remember.
As well as a researcher at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH. She has earned a BA and an MS from Cornell University and has been a Certified Professional Ergonomist since 2006. 2006 to 2016, Marisol led the development of Toyota Motor North America's ergonomic systems, encompassing model ergonomic processes, risk assessment tools, training, and auditing. In her role as a Regional Ergonomics Manager, she managed a team of ergonomists supporting Toyota's 15th North American manufacturing facilities and had a very famous exoskeleton integration there. Currently, Marisol holds the Certified Professional Ergonomist CPE credential and is the Global Ergonomics Manager at Vibrance Technology Incorporated. Marisol, did we miss anything else?
No, just a few day jobs here and there, but it's okay. We'll probably get to them during the podcast.
Special thanks to George for typing up the introduction and pulling in all the material together. Where do we want to get started, guys?
Well, I think the work at Toyota, I think, is quite interesting. So I don't know if Marisol, if you could kind of talk about some of the, not exact details, but some of the lessons learned and things that you took away from, exceptionally good work with upper body exoskeletons.
Yep. Yeah, I'll tell you how I've looked at and integrated exos throughout my day jobs, as I call them, right? Because I'm involved in all this other stuff on the side, but it's truly those day jobs, like with Toyota, AWS, Liberty Mutual, and currently with Vibrance, right, where I really I've tried to integrate these devices as well as possible. But sort of going back, way back in time, so it was, I think, 2016 or so, and we forever, since I have been with Toyota, I was started in 2006. So for 10 years or so, we had a lot of issues North America wide and really globally when you think about it with underbody work. And that's when the team members are working on the chassis of the vehicle from below. The vehicle is moving on a carrier overhead. And despite all our North American ergonomics design guidelines and standards and processing requirements, no high risk processes, all the work that we did and reducing push forces, the works, we still couldn't get rid of that overhead work, right? The shoulder fatigue and such, because the carriers, they don't rotate, putting the vehicle in a good position for the team members. So that we tried to integrate that several times and never really got it through. It's actually pretty complicated to do that, to turn a vehicle around on its side and all that. So you pretty much have to change the structure of how the vehicle is built, which would take forever, needs new crash testing, the works. So it's not as easy as, well, why don't you turn the vehicle on its side, So we had to look for other solutions. And I think that was when myself and a few other of the plant safety members were attending a safety meeting where there was one of the first vendors for exoskeletons, which is Exobionics, and they were showcasing their product. And we were all like, ding, 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 bright idea. Hey, we could possibly use this in the underbody lines to support the shoulders when the team members are engaging in overhead work. And, some of the plants, as you find in any organization, some of the plants jumped on it right away. Other plants were like, oh, I don't know about that. I don't think anybody's going to wear that ever. So starting in late 2016, we started testing those and really learning and such. And at first it was completely voluntary. So it was, try this, let me know what you think and such. And a lot of the team members jumped on it. And then it started getting a little bit more structured, right? We started doing a lot of feedback surveys and surveys on ratings of perceived exertion, which is a commonly used subjective feedback tool in the world of ergonomics, and started getting really good feedback, doing discomfort surveys and team members saying that they felt better at the end of the day wearing the device and such. Again, just still voluntary. And then we started getting even more structured in terms of doing some studies, some more objective studies looking at muscle fatigue. So we did some EMG studies with a couple of studies with the Iowa State University and got the data that we were hoping for, honestly, which is noting why there's better comfort, right? Which is because there was less muscle fatigue involved in the muscle groups that they were testing. So all that together, right? So that led us to form a work group with representatives from Toyota North America, from all the different plants, and develop an internal regional standard. So we had to decide which course these devices were going to take, right? Was it going to be a nice to have sort of thing? Hey, if you want one, you wear it, but if you don't want one, you don't wear it, yet you're in a process that may actually cause some, injuries to the shoulder. And we all decided to go in the direction that if the process met specific criteria, then it was really almost like a moral obligation to, have those team members protected from the effects, from the, negative effects that could come about from those processes. So we wrote a standard detailing a procedure by which to decide upon which processes those would be, right? Which is basically the processes that had significant overhead work. So there was a mathematical formula for that. And then we also set out to make sure that, to evaluate the safety part of wearing an exo on the line, right? So there's lots of moving parts on an assembly line. So making sure there was no getting caught on anything or accidentally activating light curtains and such on the assembly line. And once all those things were squared off, then that process would be mandatory for shoulder exoskeleton, which meant that every single person working on that process, because Toyota has a lot of rotation, so a lot of people cycle through a process, right? So a process is not just one or two people, because there's two shifts. It could be 10 people or more actually doing that process. So then if all those conditions were met, that process, so all the people working on that process would be required to wear shoulder exoskeletons. So that was in 2019 when that rolled out as per the standard. And, I think it was looking back, was definitely an experiment, right? I think it was kind of out there, kind of ahead of its time, but I think we learned a lot. I don't think we would have learned as much if we hadn't made it mandatory, because then we would have always been like, well, the effects, like maybe people weren't wearing it or some are wearing it more than others, but when you make something mandatory, then you can be pretty sure that everybody's wearing it at all times on that process. So after months, we saw that there were no shoulder injuries. So that was amazing. And that was, I always call that icing on the cake, because you had the great feedback in terms of the better comfort and all that stuff, and the great, verbal feedback that a lot of the team members were giving. And then you had the no injuries, no costs, all of that. Now that all sounds great, but it was such a huge effort. This was a program, this was an internal written standard, something that had to be implemented and kept up at all times, like any other standard at Toyota. And it took a huge amount of manpower. It took a lot of, safety folks at the plants to implement this day in, day out, attend to the team members' concerns, fitting concerns, maintenance concerns, all sorts of things, changing processes. Toyota is very dynamic, right? The processes are not static. They're changing all the time because of, quality improvements or efficiency improvements or all sorts of things. So it was sort of like a constant evaluation. Is this still a process where you need to wear an exoskeleton? So a lot of work involved in that. And unfortunately, COVID came along and, definitely negatively affected a lot of things, including our exoskeleton program, I think. So, and it's not because of, like the virus itself or anything like that. So, every team member had their own exoskeleton. But the downside of all of this is that all the sanitization and all the COVID protocols that had to be implemented corporate wide or manufacturing wide, well, guess what? It was the same people that were administering the exoskeleton program, right? That typically fell onto the safety folks pretty much everywhere out there, right? Industrial hygiene, safety had to come up with all that, implement all those standards and all that. So the program definitely suffered through that. But we also learned quite a bit in terms of, that mandatory implementation. We learned that even though we had initially applied the exos on processes with looking at the overall percentage of time spent overhead, we learned that wasn't the only thing that we should have been paying attention to. We should have also been looking at the dynamic nature of the work, which means not just the overall percentage of cycle time overhead, but also, how many times there were essentially moving up and down to pick up parts or tools or, all sorts of things, move in and out of the vehicle. So those items are important as well. So we found that the team members that were, going up and down a lot had some resistance to wearing the devices. So, and we learned that in the processes that were more static, right? So the longer period of time you were using your arms overhead, the more acceptance there was to using these devices. So it was definitely, there were other reasons too, but it was a lot of data gained through that effort. And I think to this day, it's really not at Toyota. Obviously, I haven't been there since 2021. I'm not entirely sure what's come about, but I think you find that trend industry wide, right? For the shoulder exos, there's a lot more acceptance for more static work as compared to more dynamic work. So I think maybe when exos are purely AI driven and they're powered and they're smart and, we can go up and then like there's no resistance coming down and they move naturally with your body. I think hopefully there will be more acceptance because users won't feel uncomfortable when they're going from an upward to a downward motion. But I think for now there's still a resistance and I think they're more accepted in the static jobs. So again, learned a lot from Toyota. I went to AWS after that and tried to look around and see I was there to fix problems, obviously, and start an ergonomics program. But there was some work that visiting some of the data centers that immediately jumped out at me, which was some of the preparation that was needed to receive racks and servers. And so I tinkered with back exoskeletons there. And that was really interesting because it was completely different culture from Toyota. So night and day, right? Tech industry versus automotive, completely different. And there was interest in exoskeletons. There were also a lot of concerns. So, so at Toyota, we had called it PPE, but at AWS, I think, they weren't really grabbing onto PPE, as much as they had at Toyota. And I think part of it is, at the time that we were looking at back exoskeletons at AWS, there had been a huge effort for technicians to wear gloves, right? Laceration proof gloves to work on the servers and all that. And I think there had been just this huge initiative around that. And of course, that's PPE, right? You can't really call gloves anything else. It's purely PPE. And I think when I remember talking to a technician and asking them, do you think this is PPE? And they were like, oh, if you call this PPE, nobody's ever going to wear it here. So it was kind of interesting to hear that. They preferred to call it a tool. So, and it made sense to me because they weren't a very, standardized environment, right? It's not like every day they got, 60 racks to prep, right? Some days they got 4, the next day they might get 80. So depending on the flow and the demand and all that. So they saw it as, in the very small trial group that we had, they saw it as a tool, right? So they thought, all right, if I have a day where we're getting 80 racks in, I'm going to have to work a lot. So I'm going to prepare by putting on this device. But if I have a day where it's a couple of racks coming in, that I probably don't need to bother putting it on, right? So that kind of jives well with that mindset. So it was definitely an interesting experiment there. And it was a successful proof of concept. I would just call it that, proof of concept that, as I understand it, I left AWS in 2023, but as I understand it, it's been developed to be a much larger trial and possibly even an implementation globally. So that was kind of cool to see when I caught up with some of my colleagues. And then when I moved on to Liberty Mutual, I was really in a consulting role. So there, when I went out and spoke to various clients, a lot of them were in distribution centers. And we know distribution centers can be pretty tough environments, right? So even if you do everything right, everything's at the best height, all the equipment is good, but nevertheless, they're lifting all day long, right? So what more can you do? So I would certainly expose them and advise them on possible exoskeleton usage. So I was really surprised. A lot of companies had never even heard about exoskeletons, or they had heard the wrong things, the wrong information. So it was really just, hey, this exists out here. You should go through the hierarchy of controls and consider probably stronger ones to fix your problems. But if you cannot get there for whatever reason, there is something else that you can consider. So it was a lot of, providing information and exposure more so than actual implementation there.
Wow,
That
that's
was
Sorry, I talked a lot. Is that okay?
that's quite.
that is a great overview.
It's a great overview, and I'd like to maybe I'm just thinking of some things that were going through my head, and so if we could just touch on maybe just for a couple minutes on this idea of, is an exoskeleton a PPE or not a PPE? And there's no right answer, so we know there's no right answer, but maybe just what are some of the, why is that a tough discussion, in some sense? Because, right, I mean, corporations have one idea, people have another idea, safety ergonomists have a third idea or something. So I don't know if you could maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think like you said, I don't think it matters what you call it. I think you need to call it what you need to call it and what fits well in your culture. So again, Toyota had a very strong sort of, you do a risk assessment, and based on the risk assessment, you decide on the PPE, right? And all the areas are different, and you wear this in this area and you wear this other thing in this other area based on the risk, right? So, but maybe some other organizations are not quite like that, right? So really what makes sense to them. So I remember a long time ago in an AXG meeting that Tesla referred to the exoskeletons they were trialing at the time. They call them engineering controls. They call them lighter engineering controls as compared to, jigs and assists and such. So they wanted to put it at that level. I could see that. I could see that working. I could see tool, like I explained about, I could see that working as well, right? So I don't think it really needs to be one or another classification. It's really what works well. So right now at Vibrance, I'm looking at back exoskeletons as well. Definitely, we've got some problems, right? And definitely looking at a lot of automation and engineering controls in addition to exoskeletons, right? We can't automate everything because we have some high volume operations where we can automate. But when we have low volume operations, well, you can't really automate, right? You can't automate everything because it just doesn't make any sense. So in those low volume operations, we could use back exoskeletons. I'm thinking of them as PPE at this point in time, but again, really haven't gone there yet. So we'll kind of see how it works. So what I'm getting is the vibe that, maybe in manufacturing, PPE is a lot more accepted than in other industries. So for example, like tech industry and such. So, and again, that's just a big generalization, but I think again, in consulting, I've seen quite a bit there too. And it seems to be that trend, right? But again, it might just be an overgeneralization. So in short, I don't really think it matters what you call it, as long as it makes sense to organization and as long as you can be consistent and standardized throughout. I think that's really what makes most sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that it's nice not to look at occupational exoskeletons in a vacuum, but in the context of other ergonomic emerging technology like augmented reality, AI to go through data analysis, cobots or robotic devices that are working together with the people rather than being in a separate cage. And if you look at all of them, very few, if none, are ever labeled as personal protective equipment. They're all considered to be an ergonomic solution tool, which has different levels of benefit to efficiency, productivity, and safety. So it seems to me that as a community, we are starting to move in that direction, choosing on a base by base cases of what it is going to be. So, Marisol, I have a question for you. I have worked in manufacturing, as have you. How many different departments do you need to touch base with when you integrate an exoskeleton?
That is a great question, Bobby. So I think definitely many. So definitely you have to identify your stakeholders. So certainly, the team members or employees or, whatever you call them, right? Human resources, right? And maybe I can use the context of Toyota because that led to a standard. So that was as developed as can be. Right. So human resources, we talk to legal, purchasing, IT. If, I can think of IT if they've got some, especially AI or, powered exoskeletons, production, certainly. All the, group leaders, team leaders. So like the line side management and such for maintenance, all sorts of things come into play. Medical groups, safety groups, right? So how are we actually using this device? So a lot of different departments. So it's a sort of corporate wide visibility and discussion. And then of course, senior management, executives, et cetera. So there's definitely a lot of visibility into that, especially when something is new like that. And exoskeletons to this day, they're kind of new. Typically, whenever a company implements it, it's a new thing. So there's a lot of visibility into that. So you really just have to ensure that everybody's really okay with it and that their particular needs are met.
Yeah, that is my experience too, that there's a ton of departments and people behind the curtains that, unless you have worked in manufacturing, in most cases, you won't even know that those departments even exist.
I was going to ask a question about, it seemed like you were saying, if I have a manufacturing line that's got a lot of things to do, so I'm going to automate it. So I'm just thinking out loud, like I'm a larger company, so I might just really, really try to automate as much as I can. But maybe if I'm a medium to small business, I can't automate as much. So do you see exoskeletons as a fit, maybe for the smaller to medium companies more so than some of the larger companies? Just a
Yeah,
thought.
I think well, yes and no. I mean, small, medium company could still have, a lot of product flowing through and they may have high volume in certain operations. I think it's really about volume and the company determining their return on investment on automation, right? So, but I think really exoskeletons could be used anywhere. So even when you are going to automate, so automation is not done overnight, right? So I know right now at Vibrance, we have plans to automate certain areas that it's extensive. It's going to take maybe 5 years to automate everything because it's huge. It's a lot of planning. It's a lot of equipment. It's redoing a whole operation, right? So what do you do in the interim, right? So I think exoskeletons are great, short-term control for that type of thinking, right? So we're going to automate, but it's not going to be done overnight. What can we do today, right? Today, or maybe tomorrow, right? They can start wearing an exoskeleton, right? Even if it's not the perfect intervention, right? It's still better than nothing. So I think it could be a short-term control, or like you said, maybe for like a low, medium type of volume type of company, then maybe that's automation is maybe not in the works. Maybe the return is just not there and they just can't do it. But exoskeletons, right? The cost that they're at now, right? It's definitely going to be less than automating an operation, right? Which they probably won't be able to do anyway if they have really low volume or if it's a machine shop or, that type of environment. So yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm just thinking in my head, like, welding, that it seems to be like welding your arms above your head for a long time. it's steady. You have to do steady work. And so, ERSA showed, improvements in productivity and quality welding. But on the other hand, maybe you bring in welding robots and do that. But some stuff you're just going to have, people do do the work. So,
Yeah, that's a great example. While you're bringing in all your welding robots, assuming you can do that, you can do maybe upper arm exoskeletons to support the people while they're doing the work. Absolutely.
Or have both, because at Toyota, obviously they were welding robots, but then you still need to do welding spot checks after that, right?
Yeah, we had at Toyota, there were actually, it was one of the areas where they were very well received, which were some welding checks in the weld shop. So, and that was really interesting because, yeah, when I first saw it, it's like, wow, I can't believe we have, people just like kind of like holding up and doing some checks, right, on the vehicle, and their arms are overhead for maybe more than a minute, right? But upon inquiring a little further, I understood that equipment automation had been considered, but because of I think it was because of the shelf life of the model, or I think the operation was going to go away or something, like the next major model change or something like that. The ability to invest in that was just not there. So what do you do in the interim, right? You can do the exoskeleton, which will definitely be better than nothing.
Sometimes you just need the human in the loop, so you're not relying on machine vision, programming, training a model, when you can train experts or have already trained experts on site.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense. So you and Tom recently did a workshop knowing if a company is ready for exoskeleton integration. I'll be really happy to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we did a master class at the National Ergonomics Conference, and it was about that topic. It was, are you ready? Are you really ready for exoskeletons? Was the title. And we, myself and Tom, and also Matt Marino and Sarah Bellini Ross, so we all gave different sections of the master class, but the topic that was central was how to know if you're ready. And really what I spoke about was just really that initial phase before you even trial. Because a lot of times out there, you think the first phase of this is let's do a trial, right? And I believe the preparation definitely comes way before a trial. So I think you need to start asking a lot of questions about your company culture, right? So are you ready to be an early adopter, or at the most early majority, right? Which is kind of like at the earlier section of the curve of innovation, right? Because that's where these devices are now, right? They're not in the late majority for sure, right? So they're probably in the earlier stages. So are you ready to be that, right? There's, ambiguity, right? There's a lot of research on exos by now, but there's not as much research as a lot of other equipment and lots of other things out there, right? So, what you do, you have to be ready to lead the way and really develop your own internal protocols and such, right? There's no guide out there that will tell you what to do, right? So you have to be ready for that. You have to be somewhat risk tolerant, right? If your company, if you bring one device in and somebody says, "Oh, this is horrible, I'm never going to wear anything again," that might hurt you in the long term when you're trying to like carry out some other initiatives, right? So you have to ask yourself, are you ready for that, right? And then I think you also need to have some tools in place. I think you need to have some elements of an ergonomics program. You need to have a way to assess the risk level of a job, right? And you need to be able to evaluate safety, of course. And I would say that, my 23 years of experience, I think that the safety risk assessment is typically more well-developed than the ergonomics risk assessment at most organizations. But you need to have a way to assess safety and ergonomics, so then you can compare all sorts of different controls, right? So if you have a high-risk job, you have to be able to then lay out all your alternatives for various controls, right? And what they're going to do and how they're going to impact the risk, right? And you need to be able to evaluate all those different scenarios and then say, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that, but hey, we can do an exoskeleton. And if we do an exoskeleton, this is how the risk for that process will be reduced, right? So you need to have an ability to do all that and paint your picture. And then I think the last one I'll note is that you need to be able to compare different products out there. Well, first you need to define what's your important criteria? What do you value the most, right? So for example, I talked about, Toyota donning and doffing time as being really important. That may not be important in other environments, right? So for example, when I was at AWS, it was probably a nice to have because there wasn't a production assembly line type of environment. They had extra time to put things on. So if something takes a minute, even 2 minutes, it's okay, right? They're not struggling for time. So you need to decide what your different variables are that are crucial to you and your organization, and then, investigate a few different exoskeletons that would do the job and rate them in all those different parameters, and then really decide based on all of those, which one or two might be the best fit for your organization. And then you do a proof of concept. So I found a lot of times that people kind of just jump into a so-called trial. And that really doesn't work. So another thing that I've seen is the definition of the word trial, right? So I've gone to some organizations that have supposedly trialed. And then when you dig at it a little bit more, the trial was really a vendor coming in and putting their device on, one or two people, that exact shift, and then those people giving feedback. There's nothing wrong with that, but I wouldn't call that a trial. That's sort of like a demo, sort of try on. A trial is, obviously a lot more structured. You need to have your timeline. You need to have the tools, your objective tools by which you're going to measure. Of course, the worker feedback is important, but you need to have other areas as well, right? It can't just be purely subjective. You need to make sure that the devices fit people, right? Which is one of the issues when you get the vendor in for the day and they put it on some people. Again, that person may not have had that much time to really experiment with the device, so they're not comfortable. And the device, it takes, like I've seen some studies that it takes at least a week or two of time to feel comfortable with the device and really operate with it efficiently and comfortably. So it takes some time, right? So that one day, here, try it on type of thing doesn't really work very well. So there's a lot of prep. So not to scare anybody off, but I think there's a lot of prep before you even get to a trial.
Thank you for that response. That was really good. You touched on so many topics that.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And I guess I'll just mention that Matt Marino spent time on working and discussing how some ASTM guides could help you, get started on trialing. And Sarah talked about trialing, and then I spoke a bit on the Exo Workathlon work that they were doing over in Germany.
No, that is really 10 out of 10. I'm speechless. It's just all of these topics that we try to bubble to the surface. Thank you so much for touching on all those topics and subtopics.
And right, and Matt Marino talked about the ASTM standard. So those are so great. And they've, again, developed in the last few years. When I did a lot of this early work at Toyota, that stuff did not exist, right? It had just started in development. So there was really nothing we could draw from, right? But now, somebody starting now, there's so much material to guide you already. So definitely make use of the ASTM 48 information. There's pretty much everything out there, safety evaluations, ergo evaluations, all sorts of things, right? So to help you that just weren't in place. Like I remember developing my own surveys and such back in the day because there was really nothing out there, right? So now there's just so much to learn from.
What I have always struggled in industrial engineering is KPI, so key performance indicator, and ROI, the return on investment. I think that there's a tendency right now in North America business to reduce everything to a Microsoft Excel table and to be able to communicate in a short PowerPoint to all the departments and sub-departments, including finance, management. How is this device going to impact the production lines, and how is it going to impact the bottom line? Is that something that you would like to talk about?
Sure. So yeah, ROI is the fact of life for ergonomics, and it's sort of unfortunate. It's sort of gone in that direction, a return on investment. I mean, we even have competitions around it, right? So we have Ergo Cup competition at the Applied Ergonomics Conference, right? And all these teams compete to see which is the best ergonomics control that they have developed, and ROI is part of the equation, right? Innovation, simplicity, impact, right? ROI. So, and it's just a fact of life for ergonomics. I think it's developed ROI and thereby for exoskeletons, because again, there's very little requirement around ergonomics in the US in particular, right? So there's really no legal regulation about implementing ergonomics as compared to some of the other disciplines, right? Like there's plenty of like fall protection, machine guarding, all sorts of industrial hygiene related regulations, but really nothing for ergonomics other than OSHA general duty clause, which is pretty light. So I think a lot of the ergonomics programs and such that are within the US are really functioning around best practice, right? But then a lot of it falls in the area of return on investment to implement controls and such. I'd love to see it all move to just investment, right? Investment in our workforce, right? Making them feel better, making them, leave work the same way they came in the morning or even better, possibly, is my dream. But again, I wish it would just go in the route of investing in employees, but we come down to ROI quite a bit. So with exoskeleton, I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, it can be done. And I think, at Toyota, where, it was pretty well developed exoskeleton program, I think if we had continued honing it for a few more years, I think we could have definitely shown return with, all the injury reduction, less workers' comp costs, all that. But, at that time, we were throwing so much work into it that if you factor in everybody's time to execute the program and all that, even with the injury cost elimination, I don't know if we would have had ROI, to be perfectly frank. But to me, that's still a win, because we were impacting people's lives, right? And they were telling me that, they could coach their softball league when they went home at the end of the day as compared to not, because they were in pain, right? So things like that are definitely very important as well. Years of experience and more protocols. I think exoskeletons will definitely show an ROI. It's just kind of getting there, right? It's just the growth and development of the field.
And just for our listeners who are not familiar with it, a manufacturing line can have as many as, let's say, I've worked with 17 KPIs, which are key performance indicators, which are different ways, purely mathematically, to look at the health and the consistency and productivity of a facility. And you can drill down to department, process, specific product, and so on and so on. And I think as an emerging technology, what I'm seeing is exoskeletons have a difficult time being reduced to numbers. So you can visualize the impact in something like a spreadsheet, data table, Excel, but it's relatively easy to visualize the cost, which is the time and effort to have the proper implementation and process change.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add it. It's all organizations are different. So where I am now, so there's truly this huge driver to improve operations, and ROI is not the biggest consideration, right? It's really the safety of the employees. But again, it's just really different and different organizations, right? And we can't turn a blind eye to these economic considerations, right? A company has to make a profit, or, you may not have a job, right? So it's nice to say that ROI is not important, but in a lot of, again, medium to small organizations, that's going to be a determinant if you're around, in the next few years, right? That small profit margin. So it's definitely an important consideration. There's little knowledge in terms of what an exoskeleton is. So thereby, of course, there's going to be little knowledge in terms of how much they cost. And, when I would say that some of them cost less than $1,000, right? There would be like, what? Like, I thought there were these like huge pieces of equipment that were like $10,000, or, so again, I think there's the more information that you can provide out there. And of course, there are some more expensive ones, right? The powered ones are going to be more the powered, AI driven, all that great stuff. Exos are going to be more, but there's some very desirable exoskeletons out there that are passive and don't have any smart parts and work pretty well, right? And those are less expensive. So I think, as much knowledge as could be given out there is, definitely important for just adoption as well.
Yeah, and in my experience, even all the Exos with all the bells and whistles with AI and power, it the cost, even the total cost of ownership, is laughable, insignificant compared to trying to do full automation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe we could end on one last question of what would you what would you want to tell a corporate? What are some of the best tidbits of advice you'd want to tell someone if they were to implement an exoskeleton? And then where do you see exoskeletons 5 years from now?
Hey, no fair. That's two separate questions.
All right. So let me ask the first question. The first question would be, if you were going to give a company a couple tidbits of information from all of your experience, what would it be?
I'd say just really research all the products and make sure that you bring maybe a couple in and then have the workers evaluate on where they're going. So I think that helps a lot with acceptance. Communication is huge. So always lay out the story. So communicate. So remember working with someone who would tell me, communication specialist, will never forget. She always said, communicate the same thing 5 different ways. Nobody remembers. You're not repeating. It's like they're hearing for the first time. So communicate the full story, why you're using this, why you want to trial it, what's going to come out of it, and your best foresight, right? What's going to happen, what's not going to happen. So for example, people may be concerned that their jobs are going to become more difficult, right? So communicate what you foresee happening, what you don't foresee happening. So communication is hugely critical. And then really have a clear plan, right? So move slowly through the different stages, do your upfront analysis, do a small proof of concept, do then a small trial. If that's successful, right? If you move through all the different phases and each one is successful, then do a larger trial. The more data that you have, the more likely you will have acceptance when you roll this out on a more, to scale, assuming that that's the way to go. Because there's nothing wrong with doing all that and then deciding, no, we're not going to move forward, or it might be something that, people, if they want it, they can have it, voluntary usage if they want. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But definitely move slowly through all those different stages for best success. So those would be the best advice that I've picked up over the years. And maybe one last one, be ready for failure. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But the beauty of all this is that in a few years, these devices are going to be different. So even though you had failure today, it could be very different in like 2 to 3 years, because the products on the market might be totally different. Even your own organizational culture might be different. So, I was at Toyota for 15 years. I remember coming up with something, what I thought was a really cool idea one time for something, and then it didn't fly. But then like 4 or 5 years later, the same thing came up and everybody was like, yay, this is great. And I was like, wait a second, we tried that already, right? And now all of a sudden it's good, right? So organizations change, culture changes, leadership changes, right?
Yeah.
So be ready for failure, but if you fail and if you think it's something appropriate, try again.
Excellent. Thank you.
And then where do you see Exos in 5 years?
I would like to see them. So definitely more, smarter. I've been saying this for years, but smart, AI, understanding your movement patterns in a way that allows for great comfort and compatibility with your body. Really, detecting or predicting your next move so that you can be as comfortable in the device. So I'd love to see them go in that direction. We already have a little bit of that happening. I'd like to be more applied to just everyday tasks, right? So bring them out of manufacturing, industry, all that. So I'm not, talking about medical exoskeletons, but just, everyday life, right? I'd love to see people painting the ceiling at their house wearing an arm exoskeleton, or, working in the garage, lifting boxes, or moving, wearing a back exoskeleton. So I'd love for them to go in the sort of regular, everyday consumer type of route. It seems we've really concentrated in the big companies and all that, and I've had some successes there, but then some failures as well. So I think they need to move into the mainstream just for greater awareness and education and growth, really.
Thank you, Marisol, so much for your time. This was a highly illuminating conversation. And thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for helping us make this podcast happen.